Playhouse, I just want to thank all of you for coming tonight, and no one more so than the gentlemen on my left and right, Dr. Reza Aslan and Ayad Akhtar. It's just a phenomenal opportunity to have you both here to talk about these fantastic images. I think as Steve mentioned, we have a hard stop at 6:45 because we have to prepare for tonight's performance of The Who and the What. So we're going to jump right into the conversation, leaving, of course, 20 minutes at the end for your questions and comments as well. So we're here today to talk about the human figures that are the basis behind Christianity and Islam, the followers of both of which comprise almost 4 billion people on Earth. Together, the primary figures in these religions, Jesus and Muhammad, walked the earth millennia ago as flesh and blood human beings. And both of our guests today have attempted to rediscover those human beings within the sacred traditions. Zealot does this in a very direct fashion. It's a work of scholarship centered on the life of Jesus of Nazareth, as opposed to Jesus the Christ. While The Who and the What takes a bit more oblique angle. It is both a love story and a family drama. And it happens that in the plot, one of the characters has written a book about the Prophet Muhammad as a jumping off point to explore the more universal themes in the play. So to kick off the conversation, I'm wondering if each of you would share two things. For those who might not be familiar with Zealot or The Who and the What, how do these works undertake this challenge, and what are the differences between how you view these sacred figures and how Christians and Muslims might view them?
You can't ever go in front of an Iranian. I will stay here all the time.
What was the question?
So talk a little bit about The Who and the What, how this story undertakes the challenge of rediscovering the human.
Right. You know, I had written a book called American Dervish, which is a novel that is centered around a young boy's relationship to the Quran. And I think that, you know, I went through a process in my late adolescence and in the early 20s where I began feeling that my childhood relationship to my faith didn't make a ton of sense to me anymore. And so the process of rediscovering or uncovering maybe a different way of looking at some of the things that I had been taught began to become a real focus for me. And so one of the things that was very important to me was to try to understand the prophet and what was going on and what was that all about. And I couldn't accept the received sort of folkloric, mythic version of it. It didn't make sense to me. And so that's been an ongoing process over the course of basically the last 23 years. And I had always wanted to write, after writing American Dervish, I thought the next book I would write would be this portrait of a day in the life of the prophet, the day that he marries Zainab bin Josh, wife number 7, who is responsible for at least that relationship is why the revelation of the veil, which is allegedly the reason why the Muslim women wear the veil, is complicated. But and I wanted the portrait to be. I find the prophet to be a fascinating figure. I think he's you know, there is both precedent for what he represents, and there is not precedent for what he represents: a political figure and a spiritual leader, and somebody who is deeply human. And I think a lot of the things that sort of get worked out of the histories, or at least less attention is paid to them, are actually quite fascinating episodes. You know, in the story of Zainab bin Josh, for example, he apparently sees Zainab bin Josh naked one day through the window. Those of you seeing the play will learn about this. And it's a kind of a riff on the Bathsheba David tale, and so it's yet another way in which Islam is sort of ripping off of Judaic tropes and Old Testament tropes. So all of this way of approaching the prophet's life as a literary phenomenon, that is to say, I think it was the gradual evolution of my consciousness from being a believer of my faith to becoming a reader of my faith. That process, that was something that my relationship with the prophet has been part of that. And so in the play, Zarina is writing the book. The funny thing is, so I thought I was going to write this book, and I was like, you know what, I don't want to write it. First of all, I don't want to get into trouble. And things are finally going well for me now. And so I started writing this other thing about family drama and these two sisters, and kind of, you know, a knockoff, you know, at least inspired it by the circumstance of taking it true. you know, as I was discovering this character, it turns out she's a writer, and what is she writing? This book that I didn't want to write. So things just kind of come out when the time is right, I think, or when the time is. So anyway, that's it.
No, well, I think that's really well said. The issue, of course, when we're talking about these sacred figures, prophets, is that so often their humanity gets lost in the layer upon layer of legend and myth and theology and creed. And this is even true of the Prophet Muhammad. I mean, the great difference, of course, between the way that most Muslims see Muhammad and most Christians see Jesus is that Muhammad is a man, and that's very much firmly a part of Islamic theology, that you are not supposed to see him as a devotional figure. You're supposed to see him, in fact, as nothing more than just kind of a tape recorder, right? I mean, he's just a normal man, and every once in a while he would push record and get a revelation, and then he would push play, and then the revelation would come out. And that's very deeply ingrained. And yet, of course, that's not the way in which the vast majority of Muslims actually see the Prophet Muhammad. There has been so much legend and myth that have been applied to him, much of it un-Quranic, and that he has become a devotional character. And I think that trying to get past that and to understand just the basic human motivations of a prophetic character is not just fascinating from a literary point of view, from a scholarly point of view, but it's also, I think, deeply important. It's very easy. I always sort of, talk about, I used to be, for some of you who don't know my sort of personal biography, I grew up a Muslim, and then when I was in high school, I went to this evangelical youth camp, and I heard the gospel story for the first time, and I thought, that's the greatest thing I've ever heard, and converted to a particularly conservative evangelical branch of Christianity, and then spent the next 3 or 4 years of my life essentially preaching that gospel to everyone I met, whether they wanted to hear it or not. And then when I went to college and decided to begin to study the New Testament at a formal level, that was the moment in which I realized this incredible gulf that exists between the Christ of faith as I had been taught about him in my church and the Jesus of history that I was learning about, that these were different beings, and the Jesus of history became more interesting to me. But what I think is important about this is that even for Christians, the core tenet of Christianity is that Jesus is both fully God and fully man, that he is both these things. And I can tell you from my personal experience that at the height of my evangelical fervor, I had a very difficult time understanding and making sense of that fundamental core tenet of Christianity, because the God part always subsumed the man part. No matter how hard I tried to think of Jesus as cold or scared or suffering or anxious or in pain, there was always this voice in the back of my head that said, yeah, but he's God. I kind of, I sometimes say that it's akin to watching a tightrope walker with a net underneath him. Who cares? I mean, really, so what? Who cares? So he falls. Big deal. There's nothing at stake here at all. And then when I began to learn about, the Jesus of history, when if you will permit me to say this, when I sort of divorced his divine nature from his human nature, what arose was someone that was far more fascinating, far more appealing, far more approachable, far more understandable. I mean, when you look at, the basic outline of this man, this poor, illiterate, uneducated, pious, marginalized peasant from the backwoods of Galilee, a country bumpkin, who started this movement on behalf of the poor, the dispossessed, the weak, the marginalized, the outcast women, a movement that was seen as such a threat to the authorities of the time that he was hunted down like a criminal, arrested, tortured, and executed. That guy, to me at least, sounds way more fascinating and way more relatable than the kind of celestial spirit that he has become. And I think that's why people are interested. That's why people come to this play. That's why people, read this book, is because when they were given an opportunity to see these characters as human beings with human motivations, human emotions, I think that we care about them more, we connect with them more.
I think it's interesting that both of you, just judging from what you said, came to this. It seems like there's a factor in trying to discover the human through coming to it with a lot of devotion beforehand, that there is a devoutness in your study of your faith. But I want to grab onto the line that you said, which because you went from being a believer to a reader of your faith. And I think, just from reading your book, it's very clear that you take great pains to paint this portrait of somebody who, using historical sources and Fox News interviews be damned, we know that you have every right as a Muslim and as a scholar for 20 years to write this, that it is a relatable thing. And I wonder if you can talk just about this idea. In reading Zealot, there's a sense that the historical figure is inextricably tied to the era and the society in which they live, with all of the messiness and the complications that entails. And just in terms of this one argument that you make in your book, where this notion that Jesus was an inveterate peacemaker flies in the face of just the real historical, political ideas that were going on at the time.
Well, I think that there's a larger issue, which is this misunderstanding of what a prophet is. I think most people think that a prophet is an inventor of a religion. Prophets don't invent religions. Prophets are reformers of their own religion. Jesus did not invent Christianity. Jesus was a Jew preaching Judaism to other Jews. The Prophet Muhammad did not invent Islam. Read the Quran. It repeatedly says, this is not a new message. There is nothing new in what is being preached here. This is the exact same message that was preached to all the prophets who came before you. If anything, the Prophet Muhammad was simply reforming the ever-present Judeo-Christian traditions that already existed in the Arabian Peninsula. Moses did not, create Judaism as we know it. Moses was an Egyptian preaching an Egyptian religion, Yahwehism. The Buddha did not create Buddhism. The Buddha was a Hindu. He was reforming Hinduism. It's the followers of the prophets who then are tasked with this really impossible, Herculean responsibility to take the words and the deeds and the memories of the prophet and to transform them into an institutionalized system. And the task of the writer, the task of the artist, the task of the scholar, and I would even say the task of the person of faith, is to first and foremost figure out how to separate the institution from the prophet. And I think that when you do that, you not only get a greater sense of who these people were and what they actually meant, but I think that you get drawn into them more. I think that honestly, I love the way that Ayad said it, that, went from a believer to a reader. I would say that there is greater intimacy in being a reader than being a believer.
I think not greater intimacy, a wider set of preoccupations and concerns, a deeper sense of daily engagement, because it's not about trying to get something other than knowledge and trying to learn more about something. It's not utilitarian.
Right.
It's not to some end about my salvation or some being in the right, or which is all fine. It's all very good if you like that sort of thing. But
it's not do's and don'ts. It's not myths and rituals. I'm not saying those things aren't important. Of course they're important. They give a profound sense of meaning. And they also, more than anything else, provide a language that allows a community to then express to each other and to themselves the ineffable experience of faith. All those things are incredibly valuable. But I do believe that that sense of intimacy that is at the heart of, I think, the believer's quest, it can be better achieved by being a reader than by being a believer. Because when you're a believer, there's all this stuff in the way. The institution is in the way, in other words. The Sufis have this great line where they say that in order to know God, the first thing that you have to do is break through the shell of religion, is how they refer to it. Break through the shell of religion, and then you'll know God.
Striking the face of the form.
And that's exactly, most overtly in your book, but also implicitly in the play, there's the double bind, and it's not just the socio-political environment in which that figure lived, it's also the socio-political environment in which the story's being written.
Exactly.
So it's not just untying, it's two knots that have to be undone. And I wonder, there are a couple of examples in your book that I found spoke to this perfectly. There's the idea of both of John the Baptist and the way that his role diminishes. There is Paul, or Saul of Tarsus, that becomes Paul. And it just seems like the task becomes so much more monumentally difficult when there's, in cracking that shell. And I know it's something that, again, it's just alluded to. It's, the play is a beautiful romantic comedy and family drama that just also happens to grapple with a lot of these larger questions. But
go figure.
There's this great moment in the play. I'm not on a ruin for it. There's this wonderful moment in the play in which Zarina and Eli are talking to each other, and there's this issue about how Eli says, if a story, I'm going to screw this up. But
good job so far.
Is Eli here? Can you say it for me? If a story, makes you feel compassion, if it makes you feel, helpful and blessed, then who cares if it's true? That the facts of the story are less important than the truth of the story. That is the definition of Scripture. I think this is the thing that is very hard for a modern audience to understand, which is that what you and I mean when we use the word history, what everybody in this room thinks of when I say the word history, is wholly a product of the modern world. Your definition of history as an accumulation of empirically verifiable facts and events is barely 300 years old. For the ancient mind, history had almost nothing to do with facts. It had everything to do with truth. And for us, products of the scientific age, those two words mean the same thing. Truth and fact mean the same thing, but they did not to the ancient mind. There's a really funny sort of back and forth in the play about hadith, right? These sort of stories about the Prophet Muhammad, which have achieved, almost scriptural status among Muslims for some strange reason, despite the fact that there are 700,000 of these hadiths. And I often play this sort of fun game where it's like, you give me a hadith, give me 24 hours, I will find you a hadith to contradict it. Easy. In fact, there are so many hadiths that in the 12th century, Islamic scholars began to classify them as lies told for material gain and lies told from ignorance. And yet, every Muslim has a hadith to back up whatever they want to say or believe. And these hadiths are fascinating because they were all written in like from the 10th, 11th, and 12th century. And as Gabriel was saying, they have everything to do with the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries. They have nothing to do with the 6th or 7th century, which is what they are describing. And the same is true of the Gospels. The Gospels were written at the end of the 1st and the beginning of the 2nd century. They have very little to do with the 30s, which is what they are writing about. And so we have to learn how to understand them as a commentary on the world in which they are being written, far more so than the world that they're describing.
Right. So Judaism, as you describe in the book, once Jerusalem is sacked, Judaism becomes sort of a pariah. And so the new Gospels that are claiming to tell this story are coming at it from a very different socio-political context, and have to, in your argument, adjust their version of the story appropriately.
Yeah, and in this case, most importantly, divorce itself from Judaism. Yeah. Which is another point that I brought up, which I thought was really fascinating, which is that that every religion has this moment in which it sort of matures into its own, right? We were talking about how prophets are just reformers; they don't create religion. That the followers of the prophet who create the religion, their fundamental and first task is to then separate themselves from, what came before. So, Jesus wasn't a Christian. His disciples were not Christians. These were Jews. It's the second generation of these followers who then began to write this stuff down, and it was them who were sort of, they were the ones who began to refer to themselves as Christians, and then Christianity sort of arose by really demarcating itself from Judaism. We are not Jews, and in fact, neither was Jesus. In fact, Jesus was so not a Jew that the Jews killed him. How could he be a Jew? Same exact thing happened with Islam. You do know that the original sort of direction of prayer for Muslims was Jerusalem. That the original fasting period was not Ramadan. The original fasting period was Yom Kippur, when the Jews fasted. That this sort of the decision to then say, you know what, we're going to sort of divorce ourselves from that and separate ourselves, make ourselves something new, something unique, came much, much later in the development of this religion and this ideology. That, I think, that's an important point.
The stories, and you brought up this idea of Jewish deicide, this belief that has been so prevalent for so long that, and really because of, as you say in your book, the scripture from one gospel, the Gospel of Matthew, is the one that adds the line where Pontius Pilate is attempting, is begging them to let him release Jesus because he is so innocent. And the Jews say,
please, you Jews, please let me, the most powerful man in this city, the governor of the most powerful empire that has ever existed, a man who on a regular basis sends my troops out onto the streets to slaughter you and your children in your beds when you disagree with any decision that I make. Please let me release Jesus. Please. I know he's innocent. The story is absurd. It's absolutely absurd. And the only reason it's in the Gospels is to rid Rome of any blame for Jesus' death and put that blame squarely upon the Jews, because, as you're about to say, what do the Jews say?
May his blood be on our hands and on our children.
On our heads and on our children's heads.
So, these types of attempts, whenever there is a sacred figure that is about whom so much has been written and so much time has passed, obviously attempts to do what you're doing and what Serena, the character in your play, is doing, can be met with a lot of outrage and upset. And is it as simple as a threat to the power structure? How do you feel the motivations are for people who would create such a backlash against this genuine attempt to find a human being?
I think that's you,
I mean, I have a compassionate and generous view of that, which is that I feel we are aspirational, and we have this cognitive mechanism which has to do with self and other, duality, and that we process through a process of dialectical projection. We project things outward and then see, and so I think that our fullest natures are not necessarily things we can experience fully in our interiority, but that we require the externalization of those things. And so, I mean, those images, the great images, you know, I often say about Scripture that what defines Scripture for me is that these are the texts which can embody the greatest good that we are capable of and the greatest evil that we are capable of. I feel like if you look at any good sort of scripture worth its salt and you see the totality of the human experience, whether it's the Bhagavad Gita, the Quran, or the Old Testament. I mean, it's filled with exalted, rapturous good and genocidal evil. And I'm happy to quote passages at great length from all of them, but I won't. So I think that I can understand the outrage when people are projecting the best of us, the best of themselves, onto these figures and feeling that by having that image, there's a way that I can get to that. That's how I can figure my own ascent to that. I think that that's totally understandable. I think it also short-circuits another process, which has to do with consciousness. And I think that is a way to keep what is best in me outside of myself. And that the process of reclaiming that image, similar in a way to the process of reclaiming the legacy of one's parents, is something that makes us personally richer. And I think it's important, at least within the Islamic mindset, I think it's high time that that way of approaching the Prophet, the Quran, the Scripture, the tradition, has to undergo a challenge. Because we're only going to be stronger and richer for it, but it's not going to be easy, and it's going to take time.
Well, in fact, since we've been quoting much of it, but I think like over the course of the hour, we're going to end up quoting the entire play, so.
Actually, Ayad and I could just stand up and perform it for you.
Who are you going to play? He's going to be Zarina.
But there is, in the same scene that you were talking about.
You are a bit of a Zarina, actually.
In the exact same scene that you were talking about, where Eli, Zarina's husband, is talking about her book, he says, if the people that you're trying to reach, the men and women in my mosque, don't recognize the man that you're writing about, they're not going to listen. And so I hear you saying that it's time to say this, to begin to have this conversation, but how, I'm wondering just, how does a dialogue work between something that seems so structurally permanent?
Well, I think I'm a playwright, so it's very humble, because I don't, you know, it's not like I'm some political thinker, and I'm also not a great scholar who's really, you know, I'm writing these plays that, you know, have limited audience, a small audience, and that's what I love. I love the intimacy of the contact with real people in a real event, but so I think that in my case, you know, my dramaturgy, my poetics has been taken in large part from there's that great thing that Mike Nichols says, that the hero of a story is the character with the most jokes, which I think is actually true. And it's something about, as the Chinese say, the truth that is, people are most willing to listen to the truth that is sweetest to the ear. So if you can make an audience feel connected to a group of characters who are struggling with those things, then there's an opportunity for a conversation and a set of thoughts that maybe are not so easily had, if you will. But again, it's a different, I think it's a different, there's a different purchase and a different sort of purview than what Reza's doing.
I'm going to call bullshit on that. But the fact of the matter is that you're a storyteller. I'm a storyteller, okay? I mean, when you write about religion, you're writing about stories. That's what these are. When you write about politics, politics is just a form of storytelling. Nationalism is a form of storytelling. There are a lot of people writing about the historical Muhammad or the historical Jesus. I'm not the first person to write these two books. but I wrote them in the form of stories, which then allowed people to connect with them beyond this sort of weird walls and boundaries of ethnicity and race and religion and class and all of these other things that kind of keep us cloistered from each other in these, these kind of self-ascribed collective identities. What's amazing about stories is that it's the only thing in this earth with the power to break down those walls, to confront a person at their core level. Why? This is actually scientifically proven. I mean, there was a 2-year study that came out of Harvard about about why stories work, and it was remarkable. What they said was, and I'm going to say the unscientific version of this, what they said was, the human mind instantly has this ability to put itself in the role of protagonist in any situation. It's just this weird sort of chemical thing that we do. When we hear a story, whether it's your buddy telling you a story about his bender last night, or whether it's Harry Potter, or whether it's the gospel, when you hear this, your brain instantly makes yourself the protagonist. Which is why when you're reading Harry Potter, you're like, no, don't go in there! Or when you're telling the story about the bender, you're like, I can't believe that happened!
No, don't go into that bar!
Yeah, don't go into the bar! Why didn't you text her? This is chemically induced. You have no choice in that. It's why politics used to be about ideas, and now it's about, the other day I hung out with Mary. Let me tell you about Mary. Mary is 17 and doesn't have health insurance. It's the only way that you pay attention. So the power and the magic of storytelling is that it has the ability to carry with it profound truths that cannot be absorbed when they are presented to you in terms of do's and don'ts, institutions, or history, textbooks, or in these kind of non-narrative forms, which means that the storyteller becomes the modern-day prophet, becomes the modern-day explainer of reality. So, yeah, I would by no means denigrate.
I didn't mean to denigrate.
Yeah,
because I love the theater, and I think that the theater reaches something about us, which I think dovetails with what you're saying about narrative and our cognitive capacity or proclivity to sort of imagine ourselves as protagonists. I think as collective, as social herding animals, that when we gather in a room together and we witness something that really happens, I think that it opens us up to the capacity to have that experience as a collective mind. And that draws forth a depth and size of emotion that we can't experience individually. We can only experience together. And that harkens back to the roots of ritual. We are in the presence of something sacred and we together. So I think the theater still holds the key to that. So when I mean it's humble, I guess I mean that it's not intending to change the world in a way. I mean, I do think that what you're doing is really quite remarkable in terms of its scope and its size. And I think that what's beautiful about the theater is the discreteness of the content. So that's how I meant it.
I think I speak for everyone here when I say we could do this for another 2 hours and I'll be